Welcome to the one and only Cap Rate Masterclass. I say one and only because I've never seen a cap rate class before, so let's check it out. For starters, what is cap rate? I guess technically, it's the return the investment generates in 1 year from operations. It's the return the property generates all on its own, and this formula might add some clarity to that. So the cap rate is equal to net operating income divided by the purchase price. And the cap rate is typically expressed as a percentage. Now let's quickly touch on what net operating income is. In its simplest form, it's the rents you collect at the property over the period of a year minus the expenses you had to pay to collect those rents. And calculating a cap rate with real numbers, let's say a property generates a net operating income of $20,000. And let's say that somebody bought it for $250,000. $20,000 divided by $250,000 is 0.08, or expressed as a percent, 8%. The result is an 8% cap rate. Net operating income divided by purchase price equals the cap rate, 8%. If the property generates $20,000 in net operating income, it roughly generates an 8% return if somebody bought the property for $250,000. It's a simple and straightforward calculation, and that's why so many people use it, or sometimes misuse it, and we'll get to that later. But where you'll pretty much unanimously see it is when you're dealing with comps. If you want to value a property based on comps, what you will do is go and look for similar properties that sold in the market, and you'll calculate or find out the cap rate. You do that math that we just did, and you'd come up with the cap rate, or you'd ask the agent that sold it, or the owner that bought it, or the seller that sold it. You'd somehow try to come up with cap rate information. And once you have that information, you can use it to try to value a property based on what you think others might pay for it, based on other properties that sold in the market. You can value it based on comps, based on other deals that sold. So in the scenario you see before you, there are 3 comps. We have a 7.8% cap rate, an 8.2% cap rate, and an 8% cap rate. What you can do is take the average, which is 8% here, and you can use this number to try to establish a market value for the property based on other properties that are similar that sold. Kind of makes sense, right? So remember this 8%, we're going to use that really soon. So our cap rate formula, we can use high school algebra to rearrange that equation to solve for purchase price. So if we're given any 2 ingredients here, whether it's purchase price and cap rate, we can calculate the third thing, which is net operating income. Or in this case, if you have net operating income and a cap rate, you can calculate purchase price. So let's say that we're looking to acquire property, and the net operating income is $21,000. But what we can do is we can take that $21,000, divide it by the cap rate from the comps, which if you remember was 8%, and calculate what others might pay for this in the market. We do the math and we get $262,500. Based on analyzing comps, using that information to value a deal, if we know the net operating income, we can divide the net operating income by the cap rate to establish an approximate purchase price others might pay for it. One big mistake many new and self-taught investors make is that they'll actually value the property this way and go and pay money based on this analysis. But there's something really important missing here. Can you spot what that is? Well, we didn't value the property for ourselves. We looked at what others did. Everything we did here is based on what others did, based on purchase metrics of other transactions that happened with other investors. We didn't even discuss what we won out of the deal, did we? When you're doing anything with comps, whether it's cap rate, price per unit, gross rent multiplier, and please stay away from gross rent multiplier as much as you can. Anytime you're dealing with comps, remember this. Comps are copies. You're copying other people's deals. It has nothing to do with you. It's all about other people and what they are doing. Comps are other people's deals. And when you're out there in the market copying other people, how do you know whether you're copying a happy investor or a sad investor? Are you copying a good deal or a bad deal? And the people doing the bad deals aren't going to tell you about their bad deals. There's a lot of bad deals happening out there. The investors that bought them, though, can't talk about it. And the reason that you don't know it's happening is because the buyer that paid too much has to protect their investment. They're hoping to sell it for at least that someday down the road. So they can't go and tell the market that, oh man, I overpaid for this. Because people are going to come along and offer him less money for it. He's not going to get his money back. So he has to play the game, silently suffer until he finally can get out of the deal. And in many cases, these people become buy and hold investors because they literally can't sell it for the money they paid for it. If they just hold it forever, they can live in la la land as long as they want. So let's advance your understanding of cap rate beyond all the beginner stuff. I want to bring to your attention how 10 different investors with the exact same information about a property can calculate 10 different cap rates. And this insight I'm giving you is actually very scary, especially if cap rate is the key component of how you value properties. So for this little portion, I'm going to use Excel. You don't have to know Excel to understand this video. I'm using it because it makes it easier for me to describe a certain scenario you might see when you're actually doing things with cap rates. So in an earlier video, we talked about net operating income, and you can see that here at the bottom. The calculation to get net operating income is income minus operating expenses. Now that was very rudimentary. Your professional investors are going to break those up into more minute categories, and you can see some of them here. Under income, we have potential rent, vacancy, collection loss, other income, and effective rent. If you don't know what these things are, I have other videos that show you exactly what they are. You'll learn more about that soon. And then we have operating expenses. There are a bunch of them, and when you get information from a seller, they're going to leave some of them off probably, or they may underestimate things. When you're valuing a deal in real life, sellers are more likely to underestimate things or to forget things than they are to overestimate expenses. It's just the way it is. So here we have 3 scenarios. We have a most realistic scenario, a no replacement reserve scenario, and then we have one on the right called calc difference. And what I want to draw your attention to here is if you look at all the numbers there and all the categories of expenses and income, these 3 different investors, if we assume each investor did something differently here, all calculated different things, skipped different things, and at the bottom have a completely different net operating income. Let's start with the numbers on the left. This is probably your most realistic scenario. Let's just go with that. And we're going to use this as what's probably going to happen at the property. Now, when we move one scenario to the right, where it says no replacement reserve, you can see that this investor skipped the replacement reserve. And we use the exact same numbers for every other category here. All we did was skip replacement reserve because some investors do that. Replacement reserves are one of those expenses some investors include in operating expenses and other investors take out after net operating income and before cash flow. And we discuss more about that concept in a different video linked to at the bottom of this video. But when you skip that expense, your net operating income looks higher. It goes from $16,800 on the left to $18,300. And then on the far right, where you have a novice investor who skipped a lot of things or forgot different things, and in this case, underestimated repair and maintenance as well as skipping things, you can see that their net operating income shoots up very high. And the reason I bring all this up is net operating income is an important part of the cap rate calculation. So if you were to calculate a cap rate on these numbers, let me do the big reveal here. If you're the investor on the right who didn't calculate things correctly and you bought this property at a 7 cap because other properties sold at a 7 cap, you would have paid $347,500. However, when you realize that you underestimated repair and maintenance and you skipped taking out vacancy and collection loss, and you move over to the next column, which is no replacement reserves, you're actually looking at a 5.28 cap. That's a big difference. You think you bought it at a 7 cap, but you actually bought it at almost a 5 cap. Yeesh. And then if you throw in those replacement reserves, you didn't buy it at a 5 cap, you bought it at a 4.8 cap. This just goes to show you how coming up with your net operating income number is very important when you're dealing with cap rate. If a broker tells you this sold for an 8 cap or a 7 cap or a 6 cap, how do you know how they calculated that? Where did they get their numbers? Did they include vacancy and collection loss? Did they include replacement reserves? What were the expenses they analyzed? Were any expenses missing? I hope that I'm scaring you a little bit because cap rate can be very scary because so many people can calculate it differently. So what's the big insight here? Don't take anything at face value. Unless you do the math yourself, don't trust the cap rate. Now let's change this so that the most realistic scenario gets you a 7 cap. Prepare to be scared crapless. We're going to take $347,000 down to $240,000. And check out how those numbers change. You went from $347,000 to $240,000, and that gets you a 7 cap on the most realistic scenario. That's more than $100,000, folks. If you made the same mistakes as the investor on the far right and valued the property with that inflated net operating income number, you would have paid more than $100,000 more than you should have. That's 41% more than you should have paid if you wanted your purchase to be at a 7% cap rate. Scary, scary. The last thing I want to address is that I want you to be precise when you're dealing with cap rates. Looking at 2 different cap rates, a 7.59% on the left and an 8% on the right, you'll see that they're both about 8%. Actually, if you rounded the one on the left up, you'd actually have 8%. But 7.59% and 8.00% are very different numbers when you're doing the math we do here. If you take the exact same net operating income of $21,000 and divide it by that respective cap rate to calculate a value, you can see fairly different numbers here. $276,000 on the left and $262,000 on the right. And if you rounded that 7.59% up to 8%, there'd be a $14,000 difference in what that purchase price could be. So the key thing to remember, use at least 2 decimal places. That seems to be industry standard. The more exact you are, the better, and 2 decimal places is the minimum you should be using. And that does it for our Cap Rate Masterclass Basics course. In the next video, we'll dive into strategically calculating cap rates for different periods of time in order to gain deeper insight into a property's performance. We'll talk about what is a good cap rate. We'll talk about how net operating income differs from cash flow and how it's the same. We'll talk about when cap rate is most useful. And we'll also talk about when it fails miserably. These are the basics. Now let's move on to our advanced understanding and usage.